You have no enemies, you say? Alas, my friend, the boast is poor. He who has mingled in the fray of duty that the brave endure must have made foes. If you have none, small is the work that you have done. You've hit no traitor on the hip. You've dashed no cup from perjured lip. You've never turned the wrong to right. You've been a coward in the fight. Charles Mackay.
Welcome to Perverted Justice. This is not just a story. It's a call to action for integrity and radical honesty, in spite of personal cost. Now here's your host, Shielagh Clark.
Welcome back. This is episode 5 in a serial podcast, meaning each episode builds on the last. So if you have not listened to the first 4 episodes, I encourage you to go and do that before continuing. Okay, I gotta kind of break this episode out into 3 parts. I'm going to start with potentially some boring basic legal explanations, and then a continuation of chronology, and then a note about church systems. So for starters, I am not an attorney by any stretch of the imagination, and nothing that I say should be construed as legal advice. But I think it's important for listeners to understand the legal procedures we're discussing, because I think that will be helpful in explaining the options available to me and subsequently the choices that I made and the choices the church made. So I've mentioned the Child Victims Act several times. For those who don't know, the Child Victims Act passed in New York State on February 14 of 2019 and went into effect on August 14 of the same year. In addition to reforming and extending both the civil and criminal statute of limitations for current and future cases of child sexual abuse, the Child Victims Act opened a 1-year civil look-back window for cases that were previously time-barred. So adult survivors of child sexual abuse whose cases were barred from litigation by time limits were given a 1-year look-back window to file a civil lawsuit against their abuser and or the institutions that protected the abuser. That was, because of the pandemic, extended to 2 years, but it started out as a 1-year window. And a staggering 10,000 plus lawsuits were filed in New York State in that time frame. So for civil procedure in general, civil law is obviously separate from criminal law, and it mainly covers 4 areas: contract, property, family, and civil wrongs that result in injury, which is also known as tort. Criminal law is to punish offenders. Civil law is designed to restore victims, or at least tort is designed to restore victims. So one big way that civil and criminal differ is that criminal cases are between the lawbreaker and the state. So sometimes restitution is involved for a victim in a criminal case, but by and large, the victim is not compensated or restored in any way in the criminal proceedings, nor do they have any deciding power, like in terms of plea deals or sentencing. The victim is merely a witness in the case and is subject to the whim of the court and potentially backroom dealings between attorneys. In contrast, civil proceedings are, at least in theory, driven by the victim of an interpersonal dispute and exist to correct wrongs between people. So a civil case has 4 main steps. It begins with pleadings, then moves into the discovery phase, then pre-trial, then trial. In the pleadings phase, the plaintiff first files what's called a complaint, which is its grievances against the defendant, broken down into a line-by-line statement of alleged fact, followed by causes of action. Causes of action are the legal theories that support the plaintiff's position of wrongdoing, or of claiming a wrong on behalf of the defendant. This is what happened. This is why it was wrong according to the law. And then in the second half of the pleadings phase is the answer. That's when the defendant answers line by line, either admitting or denying every statement of alleged fact. And then they list their defenses. And their defenses are also legal theories that they're arguing would either justify their actions or reduce their liability. I hope I'm not boring you, but after the pleadings phase is over, the discovery phase starts. That's the collection of evidence. So both sides will demand information from each other. They'll fight to limit what has to be disclosed, and so on. So also during discovery is when depositions are taken. So both of the plaintiff and of the defendant. And then maybe also each side will call some key witnesses. Settlements can also be negotiated in this phase, but if a settlement isn't reached during the discovery phase, then the plaintiff files a note of issue with the court, which basically tells the court discovery is done and we're ready for trial. And the court will put a date on the calendar. And the time between the NOI to the trial date is called the pretrial phase. That's when both sides are just kind of weighing the strength of their cases, still trying to negotiate for settlements. And lots of motions start getting filed, at least in my experience. A lot of motions were filed to try to have certain evidence tossed so it couldn't come into court and stuff like that, because each side wants to make sure that they have the best case possible if they actually end up going to trial. Anyway, if there's no settlement, then the case proceeds to trial, but most civil cases end in a settlement. Back to the order of events. In April of 2020, the first draft of my complaint was presented to me. The attorney took the timeline I'd given her way back in November or December, and she extracted some facts to build the complaint from. So as causes of action, she pled negligence in hiring, supervising, and retaining Jonathan Weaver as an employee, giving him access to children, failing to warn parents, failing to protect children. That cause of action also argues that it was the church's negligence that set me up to be abused and therefore harmed. And then as a second cause of action, she pled intentional infliction of emotional distress. This one's apparently extremely difficult to prove, but basically it argues that the church operated in intentional and willful disregard to the risk Jonathan Weaver's retention posed to children. I was not in charge of causes of action. I'm not an attorney. But I was responsible for making sure that the complaint was accurate. So I read through the draft about 1 million times. It was overwhelming to read my story back in this legal instrument, line by line, as statements of fact leading to harm. And despite my deep longing to have the truth known, it was scary to think about this document being filed publicly just for anybody to read. And that produced a lot of anxiety in me at first. And also, instead of compassion for the child I was while this was happening, I felt a good bit of shame. I I guess in recognizing how straightforward it seems when it's written that way versus living it. I mean, living it was a totally different experience when you take out all of the messy pieces and the emotional bits and you just lay out the facts. And a brief note to survivors. My complaint was unnecessarily graphic. I'm going to post a link to it in the show notes if anybody feels like they want to read it. But it included details it really didn't need to include. And I'm torn over whether this was ultimately a good or bad thing for me personally. But I would suggest working with an attorney who actually specializes in sexual abuse and assault cases. If you choose to go down the litigation route, because they're equipped to handle these issues much more carefully than just a run-of-the-mill personal injury attorney, which is what I started out with. Not criticizing my attorney or her skills, but sexual assault and abuse cases really need special care, and not everyone is trained to do it properly, and you don't really need somebody learning as they go on your case. So there were a couple of minor changes that I made that I felt were important because I really wanted to be very clear. So technically, the things were true, but some of them, the language felt a little bit exaggerated and maybe bordering on untrue. And so I asked for some language change because I didn't want to leave room for anyone to call me a liar again. And most of these things nobody was there for except Weaver, and he's going to call me a liar anyway, but that wasn't really the point. I wanted to know that I was being honest. Silly me for thinking that accusations like that actually rest in reality. Got called a liar anyway. Anyway, I asked the attorney to change some language, and one word in particular that I remember pulling out was the word violently, because I felt really uncomfortable reading it. I felt like it mischaracterized an event in an exaggerated way that, in hindsight, I think it was more my discomfort with the reality of the severity of what happened to me. I don't know how to explain that really. I think I was minimizing. I was associating the word violent with angry, uncontrolled outbursts, I guess, and blocking off all other versions of violence to minimize the things that were done. I still think it was probably the right thing to do to take it out just because. Anyway, beyond wording, I was frustrated. Part of that frustration came from the restrictions of the Child Victims Act itself. It was designed to remedy the abuse of children. And since mine crossed over from childhood into adulthood, half of it was off the table. And not only that, but the church's response and all the crap they put me through after disclosure happened when I was an adult. So all of that got cut too, save for a few sentences hinting that I'd attempted to get away and that a pregnancy had exposed the abuse. So, as thankful as I was for the opportunity to use this public avenue to tell the truth, it was really hard for me to come to terms with the restriction. Not just because of the lack of clarity, but because the church response to my abuse was way more damaging to me than the abuse itself. So still thinking that the church's behavior was driven by a lack of information, I wanted them to read all of those things as clearly as the details of Weaver's actions. So to just kind of have the whole thing just cut in half, it wasn't what I was expecting, even though I fully understand why it panned out that way. So what I hoped would happen in response to the filing of my complaint, and I didn't just hope that this would happen. I genuinely fully expected that this is what would happen because, like I just said, I was operating from the assumption that I was dealing with good and ethical, just uninformed people. So I thought that I would file this complaint and it would offer some understanding or insight or information that people at Hyde Park Baptist Church maybe were missing, and that the response to the introduction of that knowledge would be a desire to correct the wrong. It would be changed, improved response to me as a person. I fully expected that the church would contact my attorney and ask, what would it take to make this right? Because honestly, how can you be presented with the information that's in my complaint and not want to make it right on behalf of your institution? If you genuinely thought before that it was some kind of consensual relationship, and now all of a sudden you're being presented with new information that should produce a different response. I guess I was kind of naive. Anyway, so the complaint was finalized in mid-April, but because of the pandemic, the courts were shut down in New York State, and the e-file system didn't reopen until May 25. So the attorney e-filed the same day that it opened, and by May 26, the complaint was publicly available for viewing online. I don't think the church knew about it then because the pandemic also slowed down the process servers. So Richard Murray was not served until July 15. Just as a quick note, Murray was not a party to this lawsuit, meaning he was not personally sued. I only sued the church. Later on, you'll hear a recording of him saying, "You have a lawsuit against me." This was untrue in two ways. First of all, the person he was talking to was not me, and they didn't even know who I was at the time, but he was grouping us together to kind of excuse himself from an uncomfortable conversation. But also, no one had a lawsuit against him. There was a lawsuit against the church. And I thought some about why he keeps conflating himself and the church. And why when I say things like, the church did X, Y, and Z, people keep isolating specific individuals when I'm trying to address the system as a whole. Honestly, I think he and others did this as a sort of straw man, because claiming that I'm suing someone who wasn't even there in 2005 makes me look crazy and vindictive, and then it excuses their poor responses to me. You know, they set up this straw man. She's suing a guy who wasn't even there, or, you know, the other one where I'm getting off track a little bit, where he keeps acting like he's being accused of being a pedophile. It just distracts from the real issue at hand and kind of excuses their poor responses. Anyway, it was pretty quiet for a few weeks after he was served, and then Todd Bender with Mid-Hudson News published a story about the lawsuit on August 2. So to be clear, August was approximately 9 months after I attempted to have communication with Richard Murray in December of 2019. So approximately 9 months passed between my private attempts to resolve this directly with the church and it becoming a publicly known dispute. 9 months of the church failing to take meaningful action toward resolution. So when Alex Valentine says that the church wanted a peaceful resolution, what does he mean besides the church wanted an easy out? Because they had ample opportunity, and they didn't take it. So as discussed earlier, tort law is designed to restore victims, and the civil justice system measures losses or damages in monetary terms. That is the way the system works. But, weirdly, many people demonize those who use the system as it's intended. When people hear a lawsuit has been filed, the focus immediately turns to the financial aspect. And in all but very rare circumstances, the plaintiff is assumed to be greedy, dishonest, faking it, vindictive, and so on. I'm sure there are lots of things that drive this response, but I think campaigns for tort reform have not been insignificant among them. It is a nuanced subject for sure, but heavily advocated for by large corporations, a fact which should at least give a consumer pause. Because an aspect of civil litigation that the demonization of plaintiffs and politically driven calls for tort reform minimize is the behavior change that litigation is capable of producing. The infamous McDonald's hot coffee lawsuit is a perfect example of what I mean. I'm sure you've heard of it. That woman was publicly torn to pieces for years for supposedly filing a frivolous lawsuit for her own mistake. But as homework, I'd encourage you to go down the rabbit hole on why that suit was filed and why she won. It's probably not what you thought. Briefly, McDonald's actually admitted that serving coffee scalding hot saved the company money. If the coffee was too hot to drink with your meal, it wouldn't be ready to refill before you left the restaurant, thereby reducing the number of free refills it had to honor. On its face, that's just a savvy business practice, even if I think it leans a bit toward the dishonest end of the scale. But what's striking is that this profit calculation included medical bills paid to reimburse people who were burned by the coffee. It was kept hot enough to cause third-degree burns in a matter of seconds, and McDonald's had already paid over 700 people for burn injuries by the time Liebeck's lawsuit was filed. But it had no intention of changing its behavior, changing its process, because the cost of burning people was staying below the cost of lowering the temperature of their coffee. Apparently, the coffee is served up to 20 degrees cooler today. The point being that besides restoring an individual after harm, litigation can change behavior. And it's an awfully sad state of affairs when the church has to be forced by the state to change its behavior. But alas, in 2002, the Boston Globe, a prominent paper in the most Catholic city in America, led by very brave reporters, published a bombshell report that exposed decades-long intentional cover-up of child sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. Higher-ups were silencing victims and moving offending priests to new parishes where they would just find new victims. Just one priest had more than 130 victims known to the church, yet the church continued its practice of cover-up. The Globe risked its largely Catholic readership to pursue this story, and the church fought them tooth and nail the whole way. They wound up suing the church for the production of documents. If you've never seen it, you should go watch the 2015 film called Spotlight. It details the whole process. Unfortunately, the response by the evangelical church was to call it a Catholic-only problem. And most changes made in policy in evangelical churches, if there were any at that time, were simply made in compliance with mandates from insurance companies, not out of concern for children in their own religious spaces. It has taken brave survivors, litigation, and dedicated journalists to uncover the extent of this same rot present in evangelical spaces as was present in the Catholic Church. Many pastors, Richard Murray of Hyde Park Baptist Church, aka Romans Road Bible Church, included, love to trash the papers, the news stations, and social media as the enemies of the church for reporting on scandals in the church. They'll tell you that the media just loves to get its hands on dirt in the church because the world hates the church and wants to see the church fail. Here is an excerpt of Murray responding to the Mid-Hudson News article about my lawsuit, which I will link to in the show notes.
Lord, this morning we ask a special anointing upon this church. Lord, all that the world would love to see happen is for God to be put away. Lord, we understand persecution, we understand trials, we understand temptations and all these things.
They should instead be thanking these people, thanking these platforms for refusing to continue to allow the rot to fester in the shadows where the church would have gladly kept it indefinitely. Churches should be mortally embarrassed by the fact that rather than following Christ's example and leading the world in the respect and protection of children, it had to be forced by the world to catch up, and largely has complied not out of moral conviction, but out of legal and financial threat to its existence. The church, as seen in my story, continues to demonize the victims who have to fight to be heard, rather than recognizing its own failure to boldly square up with the crisis and make needed repair. It should be the church leading the charge to unearth everything ungodly within its ranks, and instead they fight to keep it hidden. The Catholic Church and the SBC remain key players in the opposition to statute of limitations reform in this country. So when I approached Hyde Park Baptist Church in 2019, and still when I filed my complaint in 2020, what I wanted from the church was institutional ownership of harm done, a public apology, and an independent third-party investigation so the whole truth of what happened could be published publicly, so change could happen. Instead, as you'll see in coming episodes, the church and pastor framed themselves as the innocent victims of the wiles of a wicked, wayward woman, obliterated a beautiful opportunity to redeem the past, and cemented their lingering reputation as an unsafe church. Can you imagine where we could be now if they had been able to retrieve their heads from the caverns of their own rear ends long enough to see me as anything but a threat and an enemy of God? They could have been an example of what to do right, and instead they've become an example of what not to do. So just to back up a hair, when the pandemic shut the world down, I used the time to read quite a lot. I read books like Trauma and Recovery by Judith Herman, which is an excellent book, by the way. Suffering and the Heart of God by Diane Langberg. On the Threshold of Hope, also by Diane Langberg. Untwisting Scriptures by Rebecca Davis. The Wounded Heart by Dan Allender. And various memoirs by other survivors. I listened to speeches and classes taught by Diane Langberg. And I'm pretty sure that at that point, I'd watched at least one speech by Wade Mullen. The Southern Baptist Convention's dealings with its sexual abuse crisis in its own ranks was kind of coming to a head at the same time. The Houston Chronicle, I think, had already published its report on the cover-up in the SBC. So there were lots of articles on this subject being written. There were some books coming out about abuse in the church, about what the church's response should be to abuse. And it just seemed like the perfect time for me to suddenly have all of these resources. But, not just me. The church, Hyde Park Baptist Church, would have also had access to tons of resources to help them along in doing this right if they had wanted to take the time to consider opinions besides their own in how they should respond. And in fact, in early July, I had a book called We Too, How the Church Can Respond Redemptively to the Sexual Abuse Crisis by Mary DeMuth. I had that book mailed from Amazon directly to Richard Murray's home because, again, I really needed them to do this right. And I wanted to help them along in the effort. I wasn't trying to trap anyone. Interestingly, Richard Murray claims he never got the book, even though I got a picture of it on his front porch from Amazon. Anyway, I wanted them to get their response right and to prove to me and to the people watching that the church could do this right. It could put itself last. Everything that the church had done up until this point really should have shown me that they were not morally capable of doing the right thing. But I'm stubborn in the hope department, and I just continued to believe that they were just misinformed. And once they had the proper information, they would respond differently. So I took my time during the pandemic to just devour, not just things about abuse, but righteousness and justice and the intertwining of those terms. What does justice look like? What does forgiveness mean? What are the 97 million definitions of that word? What's the biblical definition of forgiveness? What's involved in forgiveness? Do forgiveness and justice contradict each other? I was trying to build for myself a robust framework that I could operate from that did not violate the systematic theology I was brought up in. I felt a need to stay within the theology of my upbringing. Just because I was very fearful of falling into this place that I'd always heard about, where instead of just obeying scripture, you want to reinterpret something or understand something differently so you can excuse some behavior on your own part. I dealt with this some during my abuse too. They always called it making a God in your own image to suit what you want to be true. So forgive me if I'm repeating myself. I don't remember if I've said this before, but fundamentalism has a way of teaching you to gaslight yourself. This is the one and only way to interpret this passage. And if you see it differently, then it's because of rebellion in your heart. I wanted to honor God as I moved forward, but I was very afraid of being sucked up into some false doctrine. And besides that, I wanted to be taken seriously. I wanted to be believed, I wanted to be heard, and I wanted to influence positive change. And I knew that if I wasn't able to present my case or make my case within this system, then I was going to be dismissed. So there were a lot of issues that cropped up for me in understanding scripture versus trying to make that square with some of the positions that the church holds. They just kind of seemed to contradict each other. Anyway, so I was working through a lot of big things like that, trying to establish this framework and moving ahead with this lawsuit that I knew was going to put me in hot water. We'll talk more about 1 Corinthians 6 later. I'm not going to get into that in this episode. But then at the same time, a friend introduced me to Pastor Pete Schultz of Crosspoint Fellowship in Hurley, New York. I got on the phone with him somewhat reluctantly, but I heard he was good people, and it turns out that that's true. It was intriguing to me that a pastor 800 miles away would be willing to step into the thing that everyone else seems to be running away from, with absolutely nothing to gain, while he has all these added stressors of being a pastor during the pandemic, right? So he added to his plate for my benefit. This pastor was not afraid that I was going to cost him something, that I was going, like there was no fear that I was going to wrongfully accuse him of something. He didn't have canned responses for anything that I said or asked. He always carefully considered my questions before responding. Anyway, he was just kind of with me through that whole process of filing the complaint and enduring the church's response to the lawsuit. And having a pastor in my corner through that, I think had a steadying effect, because it didn't just have me and my opinion about what was right in my corner. I also had a clergy member in that community who believed that justice is important to God, that the truth would be healing. And when people tried to make me out to be a villain, when people decided that it was their business to tell me that I was wrong and to pin incorrect intentions on me, he was able to speak back to me the truth of my intentions and remind me of the potential for much good to come from speaking truth. On more than one occasion, he's driven over to the Hyde Park Baptist Church, parked his car in their parking lot just to pray for their hearts to soften. And he didn't just tolerate me, he cared enough to be involved. Anyway, shortly before the lawsuit was filed, Katie Galvano, who was very much against the lawsuit, but supportive of me, asked me, "When did you get so brave anyway?" And I said, "I don't have anything left to lose." It surprised me a little bit when it left my lips. And I've thought about my answer a good bit in the years since. It was true. Anything that they could take from me, they'd already taken. My reputation was trashed. I no longer belonged, and my faith was forever altered. But it's interesting because I thought what I needed was proof that the system was good. But what I really needed was proof it was broken. They handed that right to me on a silver platter of certainty. I wanted to quickly clarify something, mainly for people who've experienced some kind of harm at the hands of a church, especially if you tried to push for some kind of correction also. The institutional church is a human system with a religious name. As such, unless rigorously trained otherwise, it will function just like any other human system. It is subject to the same psychological forces that drive human behavior anywhere else. It's not owed your allegiance or your deference. When you stand up to a church system, it will most likely chew you up and spit you out, not because you are wrong or bad, but because it will always function to the good of its own continuance, contrary to the point of its existence. This is not a you problem. When you're confronting a system that knows itself to be right, unquestionably right, by ordinance from God, there is no white flag that you can wave to avoid being seen as the enemy. No amount of good you can do to avoid being cast as immoral, and no amount of truth you can tell to avoid being called a liar. Certainty is a clever disguise worn by doubt and driven by fear. It is the enemy of faith and of the curious inquiry that leads to understanding other people. So while it is always important to check yourself constantly and correct your own behavior, don't you dare go looking for the cause of other people's cowardice in your own skin.
If your community is dedicated to fostering a safe and supportive environment, Connect with Grace, Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment, at netgrace.org. Grace's mission is to empower Christian communities to recognize, prevent, and respond to abuse effectively. They provide vital resources and training to help churches understand the complexities of abuse and adopt effective prevention policy and trauma-informed responses.